planes to return to flight after World Trade Center 1 was demolished. That suggests that something was taking place that might be hazardous to flying objects like aircraft that are controlled by computerized components. There's always been a question here of how access might have been gained to the World Trade Center. And indeed, here we see a photograph of Marvin Bush, George's brother, who was a member of the board of directors of Securicom, which had a video surveillance contract for the World Trade Center. Barbara Bush wrote in her biography that the contract just happened to expire on September 11th by remarkable coincidence. Bush's cousin, Burt Walker III, was in fact the chief executive officer of Securicom. But there's an Israeli company, ICTS, that also had security here and for the airports from which the alleged hijackers boarded the planes. Now, what took place at the Pentagon has been very controversial. A French investigative journalist by the name of Thierry Masson noticed that here in these photographs you do not see a massive debris from a large Boeing plane. And as you heard Jamie McIntyre report, these upper floors of the Pentagon collapsed long after the initial hit. Here you see a relative scaling of a plane in relation to the Pentagon, though officially.
I wonder if you have reminded any of the candidates for...
There is no massive debris here on the lawn. In fact, it's as clean and smooth as a putting surface. And as I used to say, I expect Tiger Woods to show up with his caddy to practice his putting, but Tiger has gone into hibernation, so I don't expect to see him out there anytime soon. Now, debris did start to show up thereafter. This is a particularly interesting case. Jack White, a legendary photo analyst from JFK Research, noticed that this piece of fuselage was moved around and photographed in at least 2 different locations, no doubt to show that there was even more debris than one had supposed. But what's fascinating here is there's a little chunk of vine on this piece of fuselage, which James Hansen, an attorney from Columbus, Ohio, has traced back to a crash in Calais, Colombia in 1995. Evidently, they kept this fuselage, these parts available, and notice it doesn't show any evidence of having been burned or subjected to an explosion. It's been torn off the fuselage of a plane in order to trot it out as a prop. Of course, you might ask, how was it done? Well, here are a couple of fellows who are being very helpful. But I must tell you, bear in mind now, none of that debris was present at the time the fire trucks were extinguishing the fire. It should have been already present. Now, I have speculated that a C-130 that was circling the building may have dumped this debris out of the plane onto the ground here to make it appear as though there actually were debris from such a flight. Plus, here you got a group of enlisted men who have a box covered with tarps that appear to be removing some component part or whatever that perhaps might have given the game away. Here's approximately the angle at which the plane is supposed to have hit the building. Now, I would observe that if the wing had hit the building first, as this would suggest, then you'd have a pivoting effect of the plane. The tail would have broken off, and the other parts would have been remaining principally outside of the building, which, of course, did not take place. Indeed, it's fascinating to observe that here's a study of first floor damage, where columns had serious damage, and there are actually 2 of them. This one suggests that the damage was consistent with a smaller aircraft, but not with a Boeing 757. Here's a second one that claims that the Boeing 757 was shredded by the support columns. Some scenarios have it that the plane was vaporized on contact, okay? But notice in this diagram what's missing. Somehow this plane has lost its engines, which suggests that, perhaps they thought that an enormous glider had slid into the Pentagon. In any case, this is very bizarre. And the massive engines of these planes, this plane were never recovered. Now, the Pentagon eventually released 5 frames, one of which was very conveniently labeled plane. And it's a good thing they said so, because if you look at the frame, it's very hard to see what it is that is supposed to be the plane. Otherwise, you see the purported impact, some explosion. Theory my son, in his 2 books about the Pentagon event, described Pentagate and 9/11, the big lie, has suggested that these are the wrong kind of explosions to be taking place. But I want to focus on what appears to be the purported plane. Look at right at the top of this gate mechanism. There's a little something there, and it seems to have a white plume behind it. Now, presumably, if a 757 had hit, it would have looked something like this. Now, we might say maybe it's a little too close in the foreground, so let's push it back into the background. There was a component of an engine that was found, but it was too small to be from a 757 and too large to be from a cruise missile, which has led to speculation about where it could have come from. I have myself, in an early article, suggested the possibility raised by a researcher by the name of John Carlson that perhaps it was an A3 Sky Warrior or a similar smaller plane. A study by Key Dewdney, who's a professor of computer science at Western Ontario, and Ralph Longspaw of the damage to the support columns has suggested that that damage was incompatible with a large plane, but perhaps consistent with a smaller, like an F-16. Well, the A3 Sky Warrior is the largest plane ever designed to take off from a carrier. It was sometimes affectionately known as the Whale. If you took the silhouette of an A3 and took that image that's supposed to be of the plane and imposed one over the other, you get a pretty close fit, perhaps not perfect, but where pilots have told me that that white plume cannot be from the jet engine of the plane, but rather is what you would expect from a missile, which has led me to conjecture as follows. There were 125 casualties at the Pentagon. I counted 36 turned out to be accountants, budget experts, and other officials related to finance. The day before 9/11, many of you may not recall, Donald Rumsfeld, our Secretary of Defense, announced that the Pentagon had lost track of $2.3 trillion. Now, he was making that announcement on a Monday, which is highly unusual all by itself. Experienced politicians in Washington, among whom Rumsfeld was one, know that if you release a huge story like that, reporters are going to dog it all week and it's going to grow legs. It's as though Donald Rumsfeld knew that something was going to happen in the meanwhile that would obliterate that $2.3 trillion from consciousness, and he'd be able to waltz into the halls of Congress and ask for hundreds of billions more in defense spending, which is precisely what he did the next day. My conjecture has been that Donald Rumsfeld gave instructions to the section chief that he should have all his personnel and all the records for that $2.3 trillion gathered together in the West Wing, which had just been reinforced against some hypothetical attack and was virtually bereft of personnel other than some from the Office of Naval Intelligence, which might have been trying to track what was going on in relation to 9/11, and these budget analysts and experts, because they could then use a missile to take them out, destroy the records, and basically abort any search for the missing $2.3 trillion, which I submit to you is the hypothesis that I find most likely on the assumption that the evidence I have been describing to you is authentic. Now, Jack White observed that this plane we find here is much too small to be a 757. Remember, it has a length of 155 feet, which is more than twice as long as the Pentagon is tall. But an A3 Sky Warrior only has a length of 76 feet, which is very comparable to the height of the building. In any case, it's obvious this was no 757. Not only that, but we return to the lawn. It turns out now that the pilots for 9/11 Truth have obtained black box data from the government, from the National Transportation Safety Board, that they have analyzed. According to the NTSB, this is the black box data from Flight 77. However, when the pilots studied, they discovered that there had been a mistake by the NTSB in their calculation of altitude, that the plane actually had an approach to the building that was approximately perpendicular to the building, that it was 300 feet in the air too high to hit any of the lampposts that were taken out, that as it got to the building, 1 second from impact, it was 100 feet too high in the air to hit the building. This is very consistent with the report of the buddy of a friend of mine from JFK Research. The friend of mine is named Roy Schaefer. His buddy is Dave Bell, who